Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Welcome to our live stream discussion about whether Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are cooking up a new reset. It's a real privilege to be doing this session, which is part of our series, COVID and the Kremlin. I'm joined today by two very distinguished colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment. Dmitri Trenin is joining us live from Moscow. He's the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center and one of Russia's most prominent and prolific foreign policy commentators. His most recent book is A Short History of Russia, which was released in late 2019. Joining me as well is Eugene Rumer, the director of Carnegie's Russia and Eurasia program based in Washington, D.C. Eugene, like Dmitri, is a very prominent and prolific author. He served previously from 2010 to 2014 as the U.S. National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. We very much see this conversation as an inclusive and participatory one. There are going to be ways for people who are watching to join us and to post their questions. So I hope anyone who's on the YouTube link can do that right now. You'll see the ability on the YouTube page to post questions, and those will be passed back to me, and I'll bring those into the conversation. Before we get started, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit and to sort of back up. There used to be this joke in Washington for the last, I don't know, maybe year or so, which was the best way to stabilize US-Russian relations the best method was to simply prevent Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin from meeting. And that every time they met, there was clearly something horrible that came out of it, most vividly at the Helsinki meeting in 2018. But at the same time, we've seen now in the past few weeks, upwards of 5 phone calls, literally in the last 3 weeks, which is the most intensive level of contact between the two leaders since Donald Trump became president. And what's interesting is those calls were originally initiated by the United States as a result of the major disruption in global energy markets. But then Vladimir Putin was no slouch at capitalizing and taking advantage of this opening and saw them as a way both to potentially create a more strong bond to Donald Trump that would not go through other parts of the US government. So a direct line into the Oval Office. And a chance for Donald Trump, who's largely, I think, we all can remember, motivated by domestic politics, to do 2 things. One, to address what he saw as a major political and economic challenge, which was going to impact the US energy industry, but also to basically create some tangible benefit from what he always talks about as getting along with Vladimir Putin. The other part of this, which I think is important to sort of set the context right for this conversation, is the scale of the disruption in global energy markets and why Putin has sort of needed America's help to climb down a tree that he climbed up at the beginning or the middle of March. For the last 3+ years, Russia has been involved in a production limiting arrangement with OPEC, which was known as OPEC Plus, that came into effect in the beginning of 2017. And there have always been a lot of sour grapes in the Russian elite about that deal, because it basically created space for the US shale industry to surge its production and to carve out significant market share, potentially or significantly at Russia's expense. So there's a lot of sour grapes about that. But what's so striking to me, for all we like to hear and talk about what a master strategist Vladimir Putin is and how the Russian elite really are, clever and, really good at sticking it to the United States, this is a good illustration of how Russia's grievances and I think the disproportionate influence of a few key individuals really blew up in Russia's face. And so we had in mid-March this showdown between the Russians and the Saudis, where the Russians basically ended up blowing up the OPEC Plus deal. And then you went into this weird world of a sort of competition between Mohammed bin Salman, the MBS, the leader, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and Vladimir Putin in a price war. And the Saudis very quickly proved that they could really stick it to the Russians and could take a lot of pain. And it was left for the Russians to sue for peace. So we now have a deal It was negotiated by the two presidents working with Saudi and OPEC counterparts to reduce oil production. But given the scale of the hit to global demand from the shutdowns of major economies, it's not really clear that that deal matters all that much. And that's sort of where I wanted to pick up the conversation with Eugene and Dmitri this morning. Oil today is trading at around $11 a barrel. That's the lowest price since 1999, the Asian financial crisis. It was in the low 60s at the end of last year. So we're looking at a major change in global economy, major hit to the countries around the world that rely on oil prices to fund themselves at a time when the pandemic is going to put huge demands on budgets around the world. And we see major economic dislocation, obviously, from the pandemic. So my question to Dmitri to start this off is, why, amid all of this crisis, is Vladimir Putin still stuck on building a rapport with Donald Trump? He's got to be more cynical than that. He's a very cold-blooded operator. We know that. Who knows that Donald Trump's ability to deliver is quite challenged, that Trump is sort of boxed in a lot of respects. And the things that ostensibly Putin cares about, like sanctions relief or normalizing US-Russia relations, are potentially beyond Donald Trump's grasp. So what's motivating Putin's outreach to the White House in the last 3 weeks?
Well, Andrew, first of all, it's a great opportunity to be speaking today to the global audience. And thank you for setting this up and starting with this very thoughtful introduction, I think. Well, I believe that, as you said, it was Donald Trump who initiated the conversation. So Putin accepted this outreach from the US president. And as you said, he capitalized on that beyond the oil price issue or the oil reduction agreement issue. I think what's important for Putin is, let me say that the sour grapes were real with regard to Russia's unease about the Saudis, about the Saudi dominance in the OPEC plus environment, the unease with regard to the U.S. shale oil, but in reality, the decision not to yield to what the Russians call the Saudi ultimatum of going even lower with the production of oil, with the oil production, was ill-timed, and they recognized the mistake fairly soon thereafter. And I think that it was a matter of time before the Russians and the Saudis, who were also in a difficult situation in this price war, before they would make it up. But Donald Trump stepped in and regulated, if you like, the business among the three most important producers of oil. Putin, as you said very correctly, seized upon this opportunity to push his own agenda, and that's not about the economy. That's not about the oil price. This is about security and primarily arms control. So Putin's agenda is almost 100% today about arms control with the United States. Now, why he did it? I think that there's a feeling of urgency that the New START treaty, which expires on February 5, 21, is not going to be extended. And if it's not extended, then the treaty is off. And for the first time in decades, the US-Russian arms relationship will not be regulated by any deal, by any treaty, and there will be no inspections of each party's nuclear arsenals. That would open up the floodgates potentially for an arms race that Putin certainly wants to stem, to limit. And that's why the urgency. I think since we're talking about just 10 months before the treaty expires, even less, only the Donald Trump administration can take the decision to extend the treaty. And that's why he is cooperating with, well, let's say, that's why he accepted the outreach.
So Gene, let me turn to you for a second. What do you think is motivating Donald Trump here? There's always been this great mystery. Hold on one second, I'm having a little technical problem. Let me just turn back to Gene. There's always been this mystery about what hold Vladimir Putin has on Donald Trump's psyche and why getting along with Russia has been so important, both as a candidate and now as president for Donald Trump. And I don't think we're going to solve that mystery now. But what's curious to me is how at a time when there's this pandemic raging and the president is, potentially able to fill an important role that the United States fills as leading the international response to a global emergency, instead of, making common cause with our allies, managing relations with China more effectively, we see the same pattern of beating up our allies, the no good Europeans, attacking Germany, attacking NATO, and carving out all this time to spend hanging out with Vladimir Putin and working on and it's an important issue. I don't want to deny that managing global energy markets is an important issue, but what's in it for Donald Trump? What motivates him to behave this way?
First, it's good to be with you all. I joined Dmitri and Andrew in thanking you for joining us today. Andrew, I think it is important to recognize that we are at a considerable disadvantage trying to understand the motivations of President Trump's foreign policy. We have had very little by way of readouts from these phone calls between the two presidents, which is a significant departure from the normal practice of previous administrations. So what we're reduced to is picking up occasional bits and pieces that come out of the White House and the Kremlin, which is really not enough to form an intelligent opinion. That said, I think over the course of the past 4 years, Trump, we have come to realize that he's not someone who changes his course or is open to changing his opinions that apparently are deeply held. And oftentimes he does things that to most observers make little sense policy-wise or politics-wise, yet he sticks to them. So the best explanation we have is that he has some sort of a fascination with Mr. Putin, who has actually, as all three of us have said previously, punched way above Russia's weight on the world stage. He has a fondness for authoritarian leaders, and perhaps a long-standing affinity for Russian and Soviet leaders. That fascination goes back to the 1980s, I believe, when reportedly Mr. Trump wanted to become the arms control negotiator for the Reagan administration. So there's something there that's really deeply held and long-standing. And Putin certainly has positioned himself as a quintessential strong leader on the world stage, and something that presumably Mr. Trump aspires to be. Now, I think it's also fair to say that the crisis has been an equal opportunity offender. And the United States and Russia have not responded to the emergency well. Neither the Kremlin nor the White House can really boast a credible, effective response to the crisis. Both were engaged, have been engaged to the present day in denying the extent of the crisis. And in these circumstances, perhaps Mr. Trump is looking for a kindred spirit who can boost his standing on the world stage. It's not something that Mr. Xi can do, but perhaps Mr. Putin.
So let me just come back to something Dmitri said at the beginning, where he said, really what Vladimir Putin cares about is arms control. And, I wish, I wish the pandemic weren't happening. And I wish that the two leaders could focus on arms control. And that's an area where if they were to prioritize getting something done, they conceivably could do some good. And they could extend the New START treaty, which expires in early 2021. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's own position on that issue probably makes treaty extension, I wouldn't say completely unworkable, but pretty close to unworkable. And that's one of the sort of sad legacies left to us by John Bolton, who created this poison pill formula that unless the treaty becomes a treaty that brings in China, it's not worth preserving. Do you see an opening here for the White House to climb down, just as Vladimir Putin has used the opening to climb down from a tree in the oil price war? Is there an opening here for the Trump administration?
Well, Andrew, I think it's best for you to answer your question. You're so much closer to the well, not to the administration, but certainly you sit in Washington. In my view, there's a slim chance that the treaty will be extended. The administration is at least lukewarm about the treaty extension, and maybe more cold than lukewarm, I would say. The president is what he is, but I think that the Russians are pushing in that direction. You know that after the president spoke, there was a conversation between Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Mike Pompeo, the secretary of state. So they're talking about strategic stability, arms control, New START extension. It's a good thing that they're talking about these things, but I wonder whether the situation within the administration will be such that those people will actually start seriously working toward the extension of the treaty, which is in both countries' interests. Putin has made it very clear he wants the treaty extended, and he wants the new negotiations to begin on a new arms control treaty, to include a lot of new weaponry that has emerged in the last few years. But it doesn't look to me that he has an effective partner in the Trump administration. So I think I'm hopeful, but my analysis tells me that the likelihood is somewhat less than 50%.
Shane, do you
Jump
go
in
ahead.
on this and say that there's nothing really inherently bad in phone calls between our two leaders. It's what transpires. And oftentimes in the history of US-Russian and US-Soviet relations, precisely this kind of engagement between two top leaders was what was necessary to get the bureaucratic processes moving on both sides of the divide. So one can hope perhaps that Mr. Putin can persuade Mr. Trump to engage more seriously. What concerns me, frankly, is that the COVID-19 crisis has presented us all with such a dramatic emergency, societal, economic, health-wise, and so on, that for the policy-making community, there's little time left to deal with other issues, and that extends to the entire bureaucracy, which probably is significantly handicapped by the fact that people cannot and so they're just the mechanics of producing bureaucratic progress in this area are complicated as a result of the crisis, and our officials, like everyone else, have only 24 hours in a day, and that's going to slow the process down. So that to me seems to be a major obstacle in a way of achieving this progress. But I do hope that Mr. Putin will prove persuasive and put all his persuasive powers acquired reportedly during his will make a dent in the administration's reluctance to engage on this very important set of issues. And let me also say that in and of themselves, these agreements, or rather this agreement, is not going to solve the challenges that both countries face in the area of strategic stability with the arrival of new weapons technologies and their impending deployment, but having a base to start from is a gain as opposed to not having anything to start from.
So let's come back to that issue a little later, because even in the last couple of days, I saw in the readout of the last call between Pompeo and Lavrov, and in the public comments made by the commander of US Space Forces, the idea that there are these other big areas where the US and Russia are competing, and there's a lot of mistrust. And I think it does contaminate or complicate matters substantially, but let's come back to that. And I'll just remind everyone who's watching that I really would welcome your comments and your questions for all of us, and you can do that through the YouTube chat. And those questions are going to be funneled to me over the next 40 minutes that we've got remaining, and I'll start dropping those in. One quick question right now, which is sort of, I think, very much on my mind, is how in the past we always assumed that there couldn't be a normalization of US-Russian relations without some progress on Ukraine. And as a result of all of the shenanigans that led to Donald Trump's impeachment, the US-Ukraine relationship has been badly damaged. And there has also been a new president came to power earlier in 2019 in Ukraine, who was willing to take some audacious steps. You saw some high-level diplomatic activity at the end of 2019 with President Zelensky engaging with Putin in a high-profile summit meeting in Paris. But I'm sort of curious, given the breakdown in US-Ukraine relations that's been caused by the Trump administration's mishandling of that issue, whether that is still the sine qua non, Gene, for some kind of normalization? Or do you think that the Trump administration no longer sees freezing the conflict or creating some kind of a more stable situation between Russia and Ukraine as a prerequisite for return of some form of cooperation and normalization with Moscow?
Well, as you just pointed out, Andrew, the Trump administration's policy toward Ukraine, toward the conflict in eastern Ukraine, has really, there's no there in a sense. I think that actually what is needed is a dialogue between the Kremlin and the White House, a serious dialogue, not just presidential phone calls every now and then. Usually, you served in the White House. You remember that presidential phone calls don't just happen. They need to be prepared. There's an agenda that's being worked on. So we have no idea whether something like that is actually occurring today in the current crisis environment and general chaotic environment of making policy in the Trump White House. So I would say that some kind of a conversation about more broadly the bilateral relationship, what's at stake for both countries, bilaterally, not necessarily focusing on Ukraine, is absolutely necessary. Perhaps we get to it sometime after the November election, when there is a new administration, regardless of who is elected, whether it's Biden or Trump. And maybe from that, we'll be able to make progress on Ukraine. That would be my theory of victory in this sense.
So Dmitri, there was an article written by 3 colleagues of ours who all served as ambassadors in Ukraine about 10 days ago, Ambassadors Bill Taylor, John Herbst, and Steve Pfeiffer. And they asserted in their article that this whole economic set of challenging circumstances for the Kremlin, in theory, should create an opening, because all of the pressures on the Kremlin from the collapse in oil prices might make Russian views of Ukraine more flexible, and that there's an opening that Donald Trump needs to basically step into it and try to bring about a dramatic diminution of tensions along the line of contact and push us towards some form of at least a sort of more stable dynamic between Russia and Ukraine. Does the Kremlin feel the pressure in those terms? Is there a connection between economic circumstances and Russian external behavior? I've long been really skeptical that that connection exists. It doesn't. The evidence doesn't seem to support it, but has something changed?
Well, nothing has changed, Andrew, and nothing will, I don't think. The economic cost of the crisis is tremendous for a number of countries, and that includes Russia. But that has, in my view, very little chance of changing Russian foreign policy, and in particular, in a place like Ukraine, which is not just foreign policy, it's very much domestic politics in Russia. So the letter that you're referring to has been read in Russia, or the piece that they published was read in Russia. And as you know, the the Kremlin spokesman dismissed it. But the Russian position remains. We're ready to have the Minsk agreement, to live by the Minsk agreement. We will cooperate in implementing the Minsk agreement in a way that we interpret it. As written and as interpreted, let's put it that way. Interpretation mostly concerns the sequence of steps to be taken by the various parties, but there's zero chance of Russia essentially giving up on Donbass and watching Kiev reinstate its authority in the Donbass area. There's just zero chance.
So given that, if I could just jump in, Dima. So given that reality, which is pretty stark, and I agree with, Eugene, and I'm just going to bring in questions that we've received now online. I'd remind everyone to start feeding us questions via the YouTube chat, and we'll start sprinkling them into the conversation. I'm going to do that now. One of the, I think, very sort of sensible questions that's come in over YouTube is, isn't this really all about Putin himself? And there can't be a normalization or a resumption of serious US-Russian cooperation so long as Putin is in the Kremlin. That's the question. Do you buy that? Or is that not, or is there a way to paper over his unique, the baggage that he brings to this?
I disagree with that. Mr. Putin has been there for 20 years, and it's entirely possible that he'll be there for 20 more years. So to focus on the one personality would be at best misleading, at worst dangerous. And I think it's a really bad policy for us to condition our relations with Russia, the future of Ukraine, on Mr. Putin's personality. That's just not a realistic policy. Moreover, I would say that to the best of our knowledge, Mr. Putin's foreign policy has generally been supported by those who care about foreign policy in Russia. So, it's not just a reflection of his personal vanity or megalomania. This is a reflection of longstanding Russian security concerns. If you look at the history of Russian foreign policy, it's been for centuries a struggle for control of the space, roughly speaking, between Smolensk and Berlin. And there's no denying that, whether we like it or not, but Russian elites consider Ukraine to be part of their sphere of influence. Now, we don't like this. We don't have to like it or accept it, but this is a reality that we're going to have to manage. And the people of Ukraine and the leadership of Ukraine will have to manage in the years to come.
So, Dmitri, one of the things that Gene's referencing is how there is a much bigger foreign policy consensus in Russia than just the ideas and the experience of Vladimir Putin. And I'm curious, one of the unfortunate aspects of Russian foreign policy that we've seen, and it began more than a decade ago, but it's accelerated since the war in Ukraine, is the treatment of foreign policy as a form of international trolling, where, in the first phase of this crisis, I hate to dredge this up, when the first call happened between the two presidents on March 30th, 3 weeks ago, I believe today, the Russian response was to arrange a shipment of gloves, PPE, ventilators that flew with a lot of, PR and pizzazz to JFK, and it was emblazoned with, all sorts of, propagandistic messages. There was a sense in that first phase of the crisis that, Russia was going to be an island of stability, which sadly is not the case. But I'm sort of curious, if you look at the scale of the operation of Russian foreign policy, obviously important decisions have to go back to Putin, but there are all these other constituencies who to be putting it kind of crudely, their bread is buttered by having more confrontation, by having more budget to put out propaganda on the airwaves. Is the tail in the end wagging the dog here? Or is it, as Gene said, that there's, these deep, sort of deeply etched views of strategic depth and, the sort of, the formative issues of Russian national security that matter the most?
Well, I think, Andrew, that those who do propaganda actually propagandize what they're paid for. They can be the same people who would be coming out in favor of a strong partnership between Russia and the United States. When the situation changes, they turn into very harsh critics of the United States, and even going as far as trolling the United States. By the way, I don't think that the sending of the plane was designed as a trolling, as an act of trolling by Russia. I think that there was perhaps a misguided attempt to use the crisis as some kind of a factor that allows you to clean the slate in the relationship. We have an overwhelming threat from a third party, which is not even a party, not a human party. It's a threat that's there. And why don't we join forces? In fact, Russia is the Russian government, Mr. Putin, are not inimical to reestablishing relations with the United States. They just don't want to make unilateral concessions to the U.S. So that's the issue. You talked about Ukraine as an obstacle for normalization of Russian Western or Russian American relations. This is not seen exactly in that same way by the Russians. Mr. Lavrov very recently basically said that we have a very big grudge against the West in this whole Ukraine issue. The guys pushed for a compromise between Yanukovych and the opposition. We helped them forge that compromise, but when the compromise was torn apart by the crowd, they sided with the crowd, and thus actually turning their backs on us and losing the faith that we used to have in them. So basically, to respond to your question, of course, there are people who make their profits by making arms, of course, but to call them inherently anti-US, I would not. I think that the bulk of the Russian establishment is fairly pragmatic, and these guys would be far better off. The Russian elites would be far better off if there were no sanctions. So in principle, those people want to have the sanctions abolished. No one profits by, except for, let's say, the agricultural lobby, who have to make up for the goods that agriculture produce that Russia is no longer buying from the European Union. Yes, these people, you may say, are profiting. The rest, probably not. So I think
but on sanctions, Dmitri, let me just jump in. On sanctions, you've written and said this a lot. The Russian government understands that the sanctions that were adopted by basically a unanimous vote in the United States in 2017 are now law and are not necessarily there to be ripped away by Donald Trump. It's not impossible, but it's,
yes, they understand,
it's almost impossible.
Yes.
And so it does require a level of magical thinking to assume that we're going to go back to
of course not.
Pre-2014 reality, right? The sanctions are part of the landscape.
Right, correct. So basically what I'm saying is that people are not, but let me put it this way, European sanctions may be a different thing. And this is what the Russians are working on. And interestingly enough, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you mentioned the article written by the three US ambassadors to Ukraine, who promised as a quid pro quo lifting of US sanctions for Donbass, the sanctions imposed on Russia for Donbass. There's no one in Russia who believes that these people can deliver. So this message was dismissed just out of hand simply because of that. But there's certainly more more entrenched anti-US, more nationalistic sentiments in Russia that have grown and become more widespread and more deeply held in the last 6 years since the start of the Ukraine crisis, and that's the reality. But the people who actually lay down Russia's foreign policy, like Putin, or those who implement it, like Lavrov, people who are guided by, let's say, more pragmatic ideas. They are looking for a new norm to the relationship. And what the new norm is will only become clear when this period of confrontation between the United States and Russia comes to a certain end, to a certain outcome. And we're very far from that. So we're confronting each other for the new norm in the relationship.
Okay. So one issue which both of you have been working on lately is, and this is a question from one of our colleagues, Gil Rosman, who I'm sure both of you know, longtime professor at Princeton, is the relationship between Russia and China, which has flourished in the post-2014 period of rupture in Russia's relations with the West. And a lot of us believe that, some of this was, as with, how do I say this, the huge mistakes Russia's made in Ukraine, Russia leapt into China's arms, but China is pretty pragmatic and wasn't exactly willing to, provide all of the goodies that Mr. Putin and others were expecting. So there was a bit of a hangover in the wake of China's being extremely careful, to spread the wealth only to a handful of, key members of the Putin circle. The first phase of the coronavirus crisis, though, exposed some of the deep suspicion that exists in the Russian national security establishment about what a potential dominant role by China in that asymmetrical relationship might mean for Russia's security. And then we also saw examples of, outright racism on the streets of Russian cities, with people attacking Chinese visitors or people with Asiatic features. We had Chinese students summarily deported from Russia due to, sort of grassroots fear that they were potentially spreading the virus. I'm sort of curious, Gene, if you think one of the effects of this crisis is going to be some form of a diminution, or at least a reappraisal of a China first foreign policy for Russia.
Well, I think some of the phenomena that you refer to, Andrew, such as manifestation of latent anti-Chinese sentiments, that has existed for quite some time. But I think what's important is the relationship at the leadership level. In both countries, relations, for China, to the extent that I understand Chinese foreign policy, and the other way around, relationship with China and Russia, that's a presidential level issue. It's not something that is delegated to lower level officials. And that's where the strategic direction for the relationship is going to be set for the foreseeable future. So yes, we hear concerns among some politicians in Russia and experts about the lack of balance in Russia's sort of strategic vector and the excessive reliance on China as the strategic partner from now for the foreseeable future. That said, I don't think it's going to affect the overall quality of the relationship, which even since 2014 has, since the time when Russia pivoted toward China so dramatically, even since then, there have been many hiccups in that relationship. And those, if I can put in a plug for Carnegie.ru, have been more than adequately covered by our authors who contribute to Carnegie Moscow Center. So I don't see this as a necessarily pivotal moment. I also want to say, and I highly respect Professor Rosman's work and have learned from his work over the years on this set of issues. I think there's been a real underappreciation in the United States of the quality of the Russian-Chinese, Chinese-Russian strategic partnership. There has been this tendency to think of it as a passing phenomenon and lack of appreciation for the political consistency.
Gene, you're breaking up a little bit. So Dmitri, let me turn to you. Gene, you're breaking up. Let me just turn to you, Dmitri. So another question from one of the people watching has been if you can sketch out a reasonable scenario whereby Donald Trump actually gets this new relationship with Vladimir Putin that he's been touting for going on 4 years now. You know, can you imagine a world, let's say, where Trump is reelected and getting along with Russia is a reality? And what would that relationship consist of? What would it require out of the United States that you think is realistic and achievable to move into that sort of, you know, what Trump has always said he's really after?
Well, it's hard for me to imagine the US-Russia relationship becoming normal in the foreseeable future. I think, though, that if there is an election in which whoever is elected president is elected with a sizable majority, someone who is confident of having enough support within the country, that person could look at the Russia relationship with, you know, a very cold eye, and do what's necessary for the security of the United States with Russia, because Russia is one of the countries that have enormous bearing on the national security of the United States. That would mean, I think, engaging on. That would mean that not only the New START treaty will be extended, but that extension will be used for new negotiations, very difficult, exceedingly difficult. Make no mistake about that. I don't think that China will be brought in. This is one thing that will have to go. If you want to have an agreement, a strategic arms agreement with Russia, and a strategic collaboration in the name of global strategic stability with Russia, covering such issues as non-proliferation in various parts of the world, various regional issues, you will have to put China to the side for now. China is not going to join in the foreseeable future, but that is not the reason to drag one's feet in negotiations with Russia. On Ukraine, I think the best we can hope for is a conflict that is safely frozen. No one is dying. Everyone is back home from those prisoners on both sides. There's a modicum of humanitarian connections across the line of contact in Donbass, but otherwise it's a frozen conflict. I would imagine that the United States and Russia would have reasons to collaborate in various parts of the Middle East, including in Syria and Libya and Yemen. I think that as the US withdraws from Afghanistan, for a period of time at least, there will be some space for collaboration. So I'm not suggesting that much will happen, but at least some of the issues will be taken care of. And at the heart of that new approach will be strategic arms control.
So Gene, one issue that's also come in, and I'd encourage everyone to submit questions through the chat part of the YouTube page, is Russia's impact on our upcoming election cycle. And part of what I think our role at Carnegie is to think about the second and third order effects of this crisis, not just what happened yesterday, but to sort of push the analysis toward year end as best we can and to look a little bit downstream. And I'm curious if you see now the amount of polarization in the United States is obviously unprecedented, and you don't need a lot of external help to see that problem getting worse. But I'm curious if, if you had to, be in your old job at the National Intelligence Council, how you would be thinking about the incentive structure for Russia to interfere again, like they did in 2016. Is the goal to simply keep our pot boiling? Is it to test, what seems to be Donald Trump's willingness to create upheaval in the US intelligence community? Is it, to basically show that, the world is, it's sort of all fair game, right? That we've messed around in Russia's domestic politics, so it's all, just desserts. Like, how would you encourage people to think about this problem going forward over the next 6 months, as we go through this really acrimonious and complex US domestic political campaign season?
Well, Andrew, it's all of the above that you just mentioned. I would also include in this list of Russian motivations the long-standing perception, not accurate in my view, but it is a perception that is shared by many involved in policymaking in Russia, that the United States interfered in Russian domestic for many years during the 1990s and earlier in the century. This is a quid pro quo, in a sense, to use a term that has been invoked in this in these circumstances. Now, my view is that despite the widespread and I believe accurate reporting of Russian attempts to interfere in Russian election in the 2016 presidential election, it's impossible to gauge how consequential that interference proved to the outcome of the election. However, I think we can say with great certainty that it was highly consequential for the image of Russia in the United States and the toxic quality that it has acquired since 2016. And I would say that if Russian policymakers are interested in improving bilateral relations with the United States in 2020, then perhaps taking their foot off the gas in terms of Russian interference in US elections would be a smart move. Because ultimately, I don't believe that this interference is going to be very consequential. We have plenty of other polarizing factors in this domestic environment in the United States, but it could only contribute to further tarnishing of Russia's image in the United States. And that's something that I'm afraid may fall on deaf ears based on assessments that we have seen so far from our intelligence community.
So Dmitri, I'm curious how this looks to you. There's been a lot of work that we've done as part of our Global Russia initiative at Carnegie that looks at the development of what I would call sort of deniable, implausibly deniable parts of the Russian foreign policy apparatus that allow independent operators to hear a signal, think about how that might lead to unlocking of certain privileges and rents from the regime for their benefit. So most visibly in the case of the troll factory in St. Petersburg and Mr. Prigozhin, who then went on as well to create this off-the-books mercenary capability in Wagner. And clearly, these are not initiatives that would be happening if someone in the Kremlin put their foot down and said, this is completely out of line, knock it off. They have some form of either direct sanction or, as I said earlier, implausibly deniable sanction. Do you feel that the campaign of mayhem that we saw, and you can start it whenever you want after 2014, and we can argue about why these activities began, whether they were defensive or more of not, sort of going on the offense in nature. But I'm sort of curious, as this crucial US political season gets underway, do you think cooler heads are likely to prevail in Moscow than they did in the 2016 cycle, where people didn't care about getting caught, people didn't care about being sloppy? This was a wildly successful influence operation, but it was by no means the most covert influence operation. It was very noisy. So I'm very clunky, frankly. So I'm just sort of curious what you think the risk appetite is today and what the learnings were from what happened in 2016?
Well, I think that that's important. The Russian leadership believes that we are engaged in no holds barred information warfare between the United States and Russia, and have been engaged in that warfare for a fairly long time. So Mr. Putin does not think of an apology by sanctioning or supporting or encouraging or ordering, as the case may be, various information operations against the United States. He is on record saying that there may have been groups of patriotic hackers or patriotic information warriors who did what they did. So it's so fair in war and love, as they say. Whether it was an effective thing is another question. I think that what the Russian operation actually brought back to the Kremlin is the realization that American society and Western societies were more vulnerable than they had looked before. That the connection between the elites and the bulk of the population in Western countries, including the United States, was fairly tenuous, that there were openings being created. And since 2014, Mr. Putin has been a wartime president. And he's been engaged in a new kind of confrontation, not the Cold War style confrontation, but a different kind of confrontation with the United States. He certainly did not shy away from using some of the most powerful and innovative means of exploiting those openings in American society. It's a different question how much Russian foreign policy has profited from that. My own view is that it has not profited at all, that engaging in another country's domestic political domain is almost always bound to fail. You will never be able to fully control that environment, and your interference can and will be turned against you. So basically, I think if the record is drawn from the experience of the last several years, I would say it doesn't pay to do what they did, although you may say on its own, on the face of it, many of those operations have been very successful. And and information warfare will continue. I don't think that there will be a major attempt, just answering your question directly, I don't think there will be a major attempt to engage, to try to tip the scale of the election one way or another in 2020. But I'm not as naive as to think that this kind of information warfare will stop. It won't.
Thanks, Dima. I'm conscious of our time, and I want to get in as many questions that folks are circulating through the YouTube chat as possible. Eugene, when we were talking at the beginning about the areas where the US and Russia do go toe-to-toe and where they have significantly comparable capabilities, particularly in the nuclear realm, and I'm just sort of thinking about words that a friend of ours used once, which was that before 2014, the US national security establishment really wasn't prioritizing Russia. And as a result of Russia's behavior in 2014 and then 2016 with the interference in the US election, that focus from the US national security establishment on Russia as a problem has now been fixed. And I'm just sort of curious, as you think about some of the developments of these new technologies that you were describing briefly, whether it's hypersonic weapons, space weapons, things like that, where the US and Russia are more likely to view each other in sheerly adversarial terms. Can you sort of sketch for people how that dynamic, why that dynamic matters? and whether that's really where, in some ways, the competition is going to be felt most acutely.
And it matters because, it's one of those low probability, extremely high impact situations that could arise out of a misunderstanding or a deliberate action in a crisis situation. Right now, both Russia are pursuing a number of technologies that you can read about in Popular Mechanics, significantly upsetting to the strategic balance that has been largely contained to the quantity of nuclear weapons. This is changing dramatically already and in the years to come. So picture a crisis situation.
Gene, we're having a little trouble hearing you. So let me turn back to Dmitri in the time we've got left. One question that came in, Dmitri, over YouTube is what the impact of the crisis is likely to be on Russia's relationship with neighboring countries, which obviously for the last going on 30 years have had a lot of ups and downs in relations. I'm thinking of countries particularly like Georgia and the South Caucasus, as well as countries like the Baltics, which obviously became independent in '91, but have had ups and downs. But if you had to think about right now when Russia is facing an enemy at home, how much capability / appetite do you think there is for stirring the pot in what is a target-rich environment along Russia's periphery? Or is this a period when Russia should be prioritizing predictability and as much quiet as possible, particularly given the fact that there's a lot of national border activity, whether it's remittances or migration and things like that, that can ultimately serve as transmission belts for the next potential wave of infections inside Russia itself?
Well, I think, Andrew, that the most important issue in the neighborhood is the relations with the partner countries of the Eurasian Economic Union, who are also Russian quasi-allies in the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's Kazakhstan, it's Belarus, it's Armenia, it's Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. So those countries are so much higher on the priority list of the Russian leadership than either Georgia or the Baltic states. Relations with all of those countries have been affected by COVID. Perhaps the most important relationship affected by it was the relationship with Belarus. Again, COVID has not brought much that's new, but it has exacerbated, it has added to the already strained relationship. So that is something that is very, very important, and the Kremlin will be paying attention to Belarus, making sure that it does not that Belarus accepts the kind of economic relations that the Kremlin thinks is best for both countries. That Lukashenko does not have the ability that he's been using for a very long time of getting the better deal out of the Russians by always blackmailing them. Relations with Kazakhstan are particularly important these days because of the wider geopolitics of Eurasia, the increasing role of China in Central Asia and other things. And there's a new leadership in, or let's say transition, leadership in Kazakhstan is in transition. So that's very important. Uzbekistan, a neighbor, is another country. And again, there are many. One of the issues that have been very much highlighted by COVID is the presence in Russia of about 10 million migrant workers, many of them from Central Asia, including from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, people who are not covered by medical insurance, people who often don't have documents. So when the virus spreads to that community, what should Russia do? And that's a very big and difficult issue for the Russian leadership. So Georgia comes very much at the bottom of the bill.
Thank you, Dmitri. So I'm conscious of our time, and as much as I hate to cut off productive and substantive conversations, I think in the interest of time, we're gonna end this now. I'm grateful again to Eugene Rumer and Dmitri Trenin for doing this. We will be continuing these Kremlin and the COVID conversations periodically going forward during the crisis. I'd encourage everyone to follow our scholars on Twitter, as well as to look at the Carnegie Endowment website for periodic updates. Thank you all. Everyone, please stay safe, and thanks for being part of this conversation. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye.